Rahman Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Again, we're continuing with our small short series on the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on the topic of 5 before 5. As the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Iqtanim khamsan qabla khams." And on Sunday we specifically focused on taking advantage of your health, specifically because that's what we had planned for. But right now we're starting with the first piece of advice of the Prophet ﷺ, and that is shababika qabla haramika, your youth before your old age. And again, the beauty of this hadith, as we mentioned last time, is at the concise ability of the Prophet ﷺ to gather so much wisdom in one piece of sentence that benefits not only Muslims but all of mankind. And you can't find anyone who this hadith does not apply to, and anyone that this hadith does not benefit. It benefits all of us. And here today we stop at the first part of it, as the Prophet ﷺ says, "Shababika qabla haramika," your youth before your old age. And the stage of youth in an individual's life is a stage marked by being between two stages of weakness: your infancy and your old age, your shaykhuha, your old age where you become frail, weak. So you're between two weaknesses in the stage of youth. And you find that a lot of people will take that for granted, and a lot of people will let that by and not even give it its due appreciation and its due work, because we know, as the Prophet ﷺ says, لَن تَزُولَ قَدَمَ عَبْدٍ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ, not a single slave will walk forward on the Day of Judgment حتى يسأل, one of them is حتى يسأل عن أربع, وفي حديث آخر حتى يسأل عن خمس. One of them is عن شبابه فيما أبلاه. He will be asked, or she will be asked, upon their youth and what they invested it in. And if that is something that we will be asked about by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it calls on us to take it seriously and really give it its due appreciation in this stage, in which a lot of us, I'm assuming most of us who are watching, are in this stage. And so, just like we said, we will be asked about how we used our health for good. We will be asked about how we used our youth and our young age for good. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran about many different prophets, not just when they were older, but when they were younger. About Prophet Ibrahim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, they said about him, قالوا سمعنا فتى يذكرهم يقال له إبراهيم. We heard a young man mention these idols, his name is Ibrahim. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't just say that they mentioned a man, but he said a young man, a fata, right? And so this is to highlight that there was this young man who became the father of the Abrahamic faith. It started with him being a young man. And oftentimes we think that da'wah and the calling to good starts later in life. Right now, let me enjoy myself. Right now, let me just be cool, let me take it easy, and then I'll get serious later on. And there's nothing wrong with relaxing and enjoying oneself, but at the same time having a healthy balance between getting serious and at the same time maintaining your rights and the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so you see that most youth will go through 3 different types of fear, or 3 different types of threats to their progress and their success. The 3 most common things that hold back youth are these 3 that you find most youth dealing with. And the first is this assumption that we all have later, that later will come and I will take advantage of that later. Right now, let me take it easy. The second is that we are restricted by social constructs that we form as a society, and we think we are limited by these social constructs of what a young man or a young woman should be, or a young man or young woman is. So whatever society has formulated a young man or young woman to look like, we think this is what we should be doing. And then lastly, most youth, you find that they'll be restricted by this sense of a higher power that restricts their own power to do things, right? So you feel like you cannot do something in the masjid because there's already older people in the masjid that are taking care of the masjid. You think that you cannot do things at work because there's already senior members at work who already have everything taken care of, and they are the ones who take care of the daily processes. Although you might have a better idea, and you say, "Oh, I'll settle down. I'll just do what I need to do, and let everyone else take care of what needs to be taken care of." And sometimes you'll see that youth will realize that there's something in the masjid that needs to be fixed, but they'll just keep silent and won't do anything, and they think we'll just leave it to the elders and the board members and the imam to take care of it, although they have capability. And this doesn't necessarily mean to go against the authority, but to rather help the authority. And because a lot of us oftentimes fall into this perception that we are not needed, we are not here to offer something beneficial, those who are older already have something much better. And then the point of the assumption of having later. We oftentimes think that when I finish school, I'll get into some sort of Islamic seminary and start learning Islam better. Or I'll start memorizing Quran when I finish school. Or I'll start taking my deen more seriously when I get older. And this is such a problematic mindset that a lot of us fall into, and simply, first and foremost, because no one knows when they're going to die. As simple as that is. That أَيْنَمَا تَكُونُوا يُدْرِككُمُ الْمَوْتِ. Wherever you are, death can find you and take you. That death can come at any time. And so to think that you have later to enjoy and do what you wished you can enjoy is only but fooling yourself. And so the next point is restrictions by social constructs. You think that society says a young man or a young woman should look like this, should do this, and we restrict ourselves from doing that which is not only good in the sight of Allah, but something that we actually enjoy. And we think because most people don't find this cool enough, or most people don't appreciate this, or some people would find a young man or a young woman to take their deen seriously to be foolish and to be too serious and too unrelaxed. And so we find ourselves limited by these ideas that society has put forth, so much so that you feel compelled to post something on social media that makes you look like, oh, you're from the cool kids or from the cool men or the cool young women, right? That you find this urge to just try to fit in, although sometimes it may not be you. And even though if it's you, you find it too hard to accept the call to become a more practicing and a more God-conscious individual. And you find simply because most people are not on that kind of level of dedication to the faith, you find that it's too out of the social norms. So you refuse it. And so a lot of us find ourselves trapped in this, and simply because society has set standards for what a young man or a young woman should look like. And you find that even, for example, at school, if you had to start getting up and go pray, you'll find yourself a little hesitant because not everyone prays, or not everyone fasts, or not everyone lowers their gaze and restricts themselves from using bad curse words, so much so that you'll find kids or young men who will curse and use bad language just so they seem like they're part of the cool kids crew, or just to fit in with the social status quo that has been made by society. And this really reminds us of a very beautiful saying from one of the righteous, Al-Fudayl ibn al-Iyad. He says, "Isluk sabil al-huda wa la yughurruka qillat as-salikin." He says, tread the path of guidance, and do not be fooled by the little who accompany this path, who follow this path. Do not be discouraged by the little, by the few amount of people who tread this path. And he says, وَإِيَّاكَ وَطُرُقُ الضَّلَالَةِ وَلَا تَغْتَرَّ بِكِثْرَةِ الْهَالِكِينَ. And he says, do not, and away from the path of destruction, and do not be fooled by the many people who destroy themselves on this path. So that we have a strong confidence as youth, as young men and women, that we have a strong self-esteem and a healthy type of pride in our faith that inspires us to do good and to call people away from harm. And then lastly, as we said, restricted by authority, this sense of a higher power that we cannot tread their limits. We have been told not to go here and not to go there. And you find in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, the ones who supported him were the young men and women. I mean, some of the first converts into Islam who supported the Prophet ﷺ were men and women. And as the Prophet ﷺ says, حَالَفَنِي الشَّبَابِ وَخَالَفَنِي الشِّيُوخ. The young men and women stood with me, and they pledged and made a contract with me, and the older men and women rejected me. And so you find that the ones who accepted the Prophet ﷺ and supported him were men and women who were young, men and women that challenged a status quo. They were young and they challenged the status quo. And you find many youth who want to do things and who want to change a type of unhealthy norm in society, or even in our culture, whether it be the Arabic culture or our American culture. We want to change a specific type of unhealthy norm or habits, and we find ourselves restricted by what society has put in place for what a youth should look like, for what a youth should stop at, and for what youth should aspire for. And that for most upbringings that you see, that you'll see that young men and women are told to aspire to things, and the last thing that they're told to aspire to achieve or to improve themselves in is their deen and their good character. And as if everything else is necessarily the most important. And you find that the righteous would use their stage of youth to grow in their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You would use their stage of youth to increase their knowledge and to gain a skill. This is the time to actually harness a skill in yourself. And a good hobby doesn't necessarily have to be something religious or educational, but even something as simple as building a craft or getting into a hobby of yours, such as playing basketball or a sport or cooking, whatever it is, that you use this time in which you have strength and intellectual power to invest in yourself, not just for now, but also for the future. And that you find at the end of it all, the reward for someone who was a great young man or woman in society who contributed positively and who sought to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the reward is so great. And the evidence for this is in the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on about a day that there shall be no shade but the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we are told of the seven السبع الذين يظلهم الله يوم لا ظل إلا ظل. He says of them, وشاب نشأ في عبادة الله, a young man or woman who invested their youth in the obeying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, invested their stage of youth obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, وَرَجُلٌ قَلْبُ مُعَلَّقٌ فِي الْمَسَاجِدِ, and a man whose heart is connected to the mosque. All these simple things that are connected to young age, and even more. And وَرَجُلٌ دَعَتْهُ إِمْرَأَةٌ ذَاتَ مَنْصِبٍ وَجَمَالٍ فَقَالَ إِنِّي أَخَافُ اللَّهِ. And another man who was called by temptation and by someone, and he was seduced, and he says, I fear my Lord. All these relate to young age, and simply because there is the greatest potential, and there's also the greatest challenges in this stage called youth. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us make the most of our young adulthood. And we remember that it's at this time in which we are held accountable, and because it's right after puberty, and that's when we start being held accountable. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy for us, and that we are invested in that which He is pleased with, and that we are productive for the next generation of young men, that those who follow in our footsteps will pick up off where we left. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to benefit all of us from this. وجزاكم الله خير والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.